With garden styles, I'd say the biggest myth is that you actually have to choose a garden style. Like there are little buckets that you put yourself into, but that's not really how it works at all, in my opinion. So in this video, I'll break down how to convert any garden to any garden style, or mixed styles if that's what you want. Most people think that your garden style will define the types of plants that you use in your garden, but that's also not really how it works. Garden styles are really about the structure of the garden. So let's look at some beautiful pictures of these styles so you can find which one will speak to you. It's important to note that everyone has a slightly different view on what each style is and isn't. It's not an exact science, thank goodness for that, right? So most garden styles can be grouped into four larger categories, and that's traditional, cottage, modern or contemporary, and naturalistic style, which is also sometimes called new perennial. Beyond the four main styles, there are certainly lots of other in-between kind of styles that fit into those main styles, but not really. These are just a few examples to get your ideas flowing. Meditation gardens, Mediterranean, woodland, coastal, tropical, meadow or prairie gardens, desert gardens, which would include xeriscaping, gravel or rock gardens, pottage or kitchen gardens, city courtyard gardens. There's so many, and this isn't even an exhaustive list, so there's lots more to choose from, but just think about it that all of these different styles would fit somewhere on a sliding scale of all of the garden styles. So let's start with naturalistic gardens. A naturalistic garden reflects the natural landscape that surrounds it, whether it's the prairies of the Midwest or the forests of New England, the fields of wildflowers in Texas, or the starkly beautiful deserts of the Southwest. This style relies heavily on native plant choices, and because of this, it will vary what these types of naturalistic gardens will look like depending on where you live. So naturalistic gardens really give a beautiful sense of place. One of the inherent goals of a naturalistic garden is to conserve resources and reduce our environmental footprint. So these are some elements of naturalistic gardens. Native plants that are low maintenance, rustic natural materials to suit that wild and free planting style, and a naturalistic garden is rooted in plant selection, taking into account both ecology and design when choosing your plants. Plant choices will really vary depending on where you live in the world. Plants like black-eyed Susans, coneflowers, asters, sneezeweed, and moorgrass are some common choices and ones that I've seen in gardens in my area, and I live in the Northeast. So next up is the cottage garden style. And this just happens to be my personal favorite, and I could talk about it all day. Actually, on the screen right now, this is a photo of my backyard. So the cottage garden design style incorporates dense, informal mass plantings using more rustic hardscape materials. You can fill your cottage garden with collections of your favorite flowers and plants that are both beautiful and practical. The earliest cottage gardens in England were grown for very practical purposes. Over time, a colorful mixture of blooming flowers has become the centerpiece of the cottage garden style rather than an afterthought like it was in the beginning. So you won't find really rare species in cottage gardens. They're all sort of familiar and really common, easy to grow plants. And they're mixed with edibles and medicinals and herbs and things like that. That's the practical side of the cottage garden. And informal plantings in cottage gardens appear to be randomly placed. They're really not, but that's what the goal is to make it look like it randomly appeared that way. And then some of the features of cottage gardens that you'll see are arbors, gates, white fencing, terracotta flea market finds incorporated into the gardens. The biggest thing to remember when designing a cottage garden is that they are of the heart, of the hearth, and of the home. Elements may look mashed together or randomly placed in cottage gardens, but they're actually really thoughtfully selected plants, materials, and features that have meaning and love for the person who tends the garden. Plants in cottage gardens are usually quite colorful and diverse, so the plants have a tendency to spill over into lawns and paths and create a really soft edge against the rustic hardscape materials. Planting beds will be basically crammed with plants, and they use every inch of available space. It creates this feeling of charm and an organized mess. But if you were actually to look at the design of a cottage garden without any plants in the design, you'll see that the same straight lines and geometric shapes that you would find in a formal or a traditional garden style are actually found underneath all of it. So cottage gardens are actually almost a subset of traditional gardens. I like to call them their own category just because they are so popular and it is something that I love to talk about. But behind all of the planting, you'll find a lot of the similar structures that you would find in a traditional garden. Some of the most popular plants for cottage gardens, like I said, they're always really common plants. So hydrangeas, roses, lilacs, flowering trees, climbing vines, but you won't find a lot of like rare or unusual plants in these, depending on the gardener. So next up is traditional garden style. We touched on this a little bit with cottage just because they are really closely related, but traditional style gardens are perfect for colonial, Italian, and French inspired architecture. And they focus a lot on symmetry and balance. So that's a big difference between the loose and free cottage garden. When I think of a traditional garden, I picture a very formal garden with really strong architectural features that oftentimes will mimic features that you'll see in the house or in the space somewhere. Wide expanses of perfectly trimmed lush green lawns, rows of orderly clipped hedges, framed views of stone fountains, and really cleanly edged walkways. That's sort of what I think of, and these are just some pictures of what I'm imagining when I hear traditional style garden. So the elements of traditional gardens are straight lines, straight paths, bold geometric forms, formal pruned hedges pruned into repetitive shapes. Things like topiaries, urns, columns, pea gravel, and stone fountains are other elements you'd find in traditional gardens. And some of the popular plants for traditional gardens are boxwood shrubs just because they can take pruning really simply. Roses, peonies, and tulips are also really popular in this style. And next up is modern garden style. So modern garden style can be defined as clean-lined, hard-edged, and minimalistic. Modern design is characterized by heavy uses of metal, concrete, monochromatic or pale color palettes. Modern design focuses heavily on the function of the materials rather than on nature. So when you get into a modern garden, it's fairly obvious that you're in a modern garden and it didn't randomly happen in nature. It's sort of the farthest you can get from that. The contemporary garden style comes from modern design, but it tends to be more natural and a softer version of modern design. In contemporary design, what is already in place is taken into consideration and enhanced. So the use of curves and wooden accents and strategically placed and or contained bright flowers are welcomed. But remember that less is always more when it comes to this particular style, whether you're talking modern or contemporary. And I'd say that contemporary design is a lot more popular with residential landscape design, and modern landscape design is a lot more popular with commercial design. So elements of modern/contemporary design style are a limited plant palette and a limited color palette, clean lines, asymmetry, smooth surfaces, and minimalism. And the use of metal, concrete, water features, and reflection pools are really popular. And popular plants you'll find are Japanese maple, architectural plants like yucca, mounding grasses like Japanese forest grass. And now I just want to talk a little bit about the sliding scale of garden styles. So remember in the beginning that I've explained that you wouldn't really fall into a bucket of any of these styles, and then here I go explaining every design style as a bucket. But I like to think of them more as a sliding scale rather than you have to be this or that. So I'm going to show you the order of these four main garden styles, the order that they go in, and then you can just sort of pick your place on the scale rather than having to decide on one of the four styles. And like I said, you can also combine these together in different ways. There's so many possibilities. So the order goes from natural to cottage to traditional to modern or contemporary. And this basically is from the most rustic and colorful, which would be natural style, to the most refined and sleek, and that's contemporary. On the sliding scale, the range of plants and the range of colors that you use will help you to define the style. So it's not necessarily the plants you use, it's the range of color that you use and the range of amount of plants, like the variety of plants that you're using. So natural and cottage gardens use a really wide range of plant types. They use a really wide range of colors, while traditional and modern gardens use a more refined color palette and a really more refined amount or variety of plants. As I said, the natural and cottage gardens use lots of color, but you can see here that the natural garden on the left is much more like what Mother Nature would design. Think wildflower meadows or prairies, and the photo on the right is a beautiful, colorful cottage garden. I think it's clear that the plants were arranged into drifts of color and texture, and that it didn't just happen like this in nature. So that's kind of the main difference that I see between the two. The natural garden is meant to look like nature did it, and then the cottage garden is also kind of meant to look like nature did it, but it's also designed and there's a color palette involved and things like that. And traditional gardens have a much more limited color palette than natural or cottage garden, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no color and no plant variety in traditional gardens. You can see that the photo on the left shows that there is some color in this traditional style garden, even though there's not as much as the cottage or the natural garden. Modern and contemporary gardens, however, they have very little color. They have a very limited color palette and a very limited plant palette. There's not a lot of variety in the plantings in the photo on the right, as you can see. So you should ask yourself, how much color and variety do you want in your planting plan? Do you want lots of color and lots of plants, or just touches of color and a few repeated plants, or do you want to be somewhere kind of in between one of these categories? And the second sliding scale that I want to go over is the hardscape materials you use in your garden, and this helps define the style very much. So it's another sliding scale. The materials you use are the things like gravel, stone, brick, wood. This is the hardscape material that you choose for walkways, for patios, for garden edging, for your pergola, for your deck, for your arbor, things like that. So what materials are you bringing into your garden and building structure with? These hardscape materials, just like the plants and the variety of plants, they can kind of go on a sliding scale as well. So natural gardens would have very rustic materials, and then they go all the way to very smooth and sleek materials for modern or contemporary style gardens. Natural and cottage gardens use a lot more rustic materials like crushed gravel, stacked stone, reclaimed wood and brick. Both of these styles incorporate materials that will create uneven surfaces, and they'll feel very natural, like they've kind of always been there. So if you're designing a cottage garden and you put in brick, you might choose a reclaimed or a tumbled brick instead of going with a smoother or sleeker brick, and that will bring out that cottage style a bit more for you. Traditional and modern gardens use progressively smoother materials, hardscape materials like natural stone pavers in organic but repeating patterns, like in the photo on the left, are more traditional in style. While smooth stone and very sleek looking planter boxes such as the solid gray concrete in the photo on the right are more modern or contemporary in style. Wooden or composite decking can be either traditional or modern depending on how it's used and the railing or picket style that you use. And if you use reclaimed wood with lots of character, wooden decking can even lean more towards a cottage or even a naturalistic style. So wood can go into any category. It's just depending on how rustic the wood is versus how smooth and sleek the wood is. So the question to ask yourself now is, what hardscape materials do you like best? Do you lean towards the more rustic, the more smooth and sleek materials, or are you falling somewhere in between the two? And like I said earlier, you can mix garden styles together. So this is the big tip that really clarifies garden styles for everyone. It's that once you know the basics of each style, you can start to mix, match, and adjust elements from each of these garden styles to create a design that is unique as you are. And this is quite the relief, isn't it? In this photo, the garden hardscape materials are very modern, but the planting beds are cottage style. So this is kind of a way that you can combine these two different styles in a way that feels really professional and still really designed. So in this space, the paths and the plantings fall somewhere in the naturalistic and even cottage style. But then there's this trimmed hedge, and it's very traditional in style. So it's a great mix as well. And here's a garden with a very naturalistic style hardscape. Rough bricks in the background, rough gravel walkways. Even the focal point is quite rustic in style, don't you think? So this is mixed with the cleaner, more traditional brick pillars topped with traditional style, like intricate containers in the foreground. And I really like that mix and that juxtaposition between the two. And of course, there's these trimmed hedges. And again, that's very traditional in style. So I thought this was a great example as well. This garden is very cottage in the planting style, but the pathway and the hedges in the back lend themselves to more traditional style gardens. So it's just another example of how you can mix those two styles. And I'd say in general, this leans a lot more towards cottage, but there are traditional elements incorporated. And here's a traditional style garden mixed with a bit of wild cottage-like planting. Since the colors are all very refined, you can see that the color palette's very limited. I think it could also be considered straight up traditional, but in my opinion, it does have a nice blend of both traditional and cottage style. So where do you fall on this sliding scale? I would try to pinpoint your garden style by picking a spot on that scale and then going from there. So I made some lists to help you out. You don't have to just go off of these. There are lots of things to choose from. These are just a couple examples of things that you can use. Feel free to pause the video and take a picture of this or whatever you need to.
So if you like this video, I'd love for you to check out my garden style mood board workshop. It takes you through the process that I use to build upon these different garden styles and make them more personal and unique to what you want in your own garden. And I'll leave a link to that in the description below.
I also have a playlist of all the different garden styles, and I'm going to link that up right here. So be sure to head over there and learn more about the particular style that you love, and I'll see you over in that video. Bye for now.